with us. My name is Phil Dalton. I am a professor of rhetoric and public advocacy, and I also run Hofstra's Center for Civic Engagement. My area of study was political communication, which is why this conference is of such great interest to me. Our session right now is titled From White House Communications to Policymaking, Planning and Strategies. And I'd like to introduce our speakers. If you'll be patient, they're very distinguished. We have first with us, two over, Dr. George Edwards III, who joins us as a distinguished fellow at Oxford University and the University Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Jordan Chair of Presidential Studies, Emeritus at Texas A&M University. He has served as both the Winant Professor of American Government and the Olin Professor of American Government at the University of Oxford, the John Adams Fellow at the University of London, and in senior visiting positions at Sciences Po in Paris, Peking University, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He's written or edited 27 books on American politics and public policy, and is the editor of Presidential Studies Quarterly and the general editor of the Oxford Handbook of American Politics. There's much, much more, but in the interest of time, we welcome you. Next, we have with us
Thank you.
Dr. Jennifer Mercieca, who also joins us from Texas A&M University, where she is an historian of American political rhetoric. She writes about American political discourse, especially as it relates to citizenship, democracy, and the presidency. She has published 3 books on political rhetoric, including Founding Fictions, The Rhetoric of Heroic Expectations, Establishing the Obama Presidency, and Demagogue for President, The Rhetorical Genius of Donald Trump. Dr. Mercieca is published in the discipline's top journals, including Quarterly Journal of Speech, Presidential Studies Quarterly, Rhetoric and Public Affairs, Argumentation and Advocacy, and the Rhetoric and Society Quarterly. She's on the editorial board for 3 of those journals. And next we have with us Shawn Turner, a professor of strategic communication at Michigan State University and a national security communication analyst for CNN. He's an expert in communication leadership, strategy, and crisis management. Relevant to today's discussion, Shawn Turner's teaching focuses on the intersection of communication theory and the execution of effective communication practices. During the Obama administration, Shawn Turner held the positions of Director of Communication for U.S. and National Intelligence at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Assistant Press Secretary for Foreign Affairs at the National Security Council, and Deputy White House Secretary, Press Secretary for National Security. Hofstra warmly welcomes you. What we've arranged to do is have each speaker, starting with Dr. Edwards, speak for about 10 minutes. And then afterwards, we'll invite people in the crowd to ask questions. But then allow me first then to introduce Dr. Edwards.
Thank you, Phil. Before I begin, let me thank Mina Bose for organizing this impressive event. Pulling this off takes a great deal of effort, and we're all in her debt. But let me also begin by making it clear that I greatly admire Barack Obama. He possesses a first-class intellect. He's a gifted communicator. And for me, he possesses also the right values. Indeed, I was living in Paris at the time of his election. Life is hell, I know. The denouement of the election occurred late into the Paris night, so the streets were relatively empty, but I remember my wife and I literally dancing in the streets of Paris on hearing of his election. So I am an Obama fan. But I want to focus today on his leadership, especially his strategy of leadership through obtaining public support. Now, public support is a key political resource, and modern presidents seek it for themselves and their policies. Their goal is to leverage public opinion to obtain backing for their proposals in Congress, for the election of their co-partisans to Congress, and of course, for their own re-election. All that, I think, is pretty obvious. It's natural for a new president basking in the glow of an electoral victory to focus on creating rather than exploiting opportunities for change. Barack Obama entered the presidency with an impressive record of political success, at the center of which were his rhetorical skills. In college, he concluded that words had the power to transform. As he wrote, with the right words, everything could change. Now, the president's advisors also believed in the persuasive power of the presidential pulpit. More importantly, they believed the president was an irresistible persuader. The White House also viewed the economic crisis as an opportunity, a catalyst for action, rather than as a constraint. Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel articulated this strategy most succinctly when he famously declared that one should never let a serious crisis go to waste. Thus, the president's team felt that the recession had left public opinion malleable and responsive to bold leadership. Based on these premises, the White House felt comfortable advancing a large and expensive agenda. Now, the premise of the power of presidential persuasion was faulty, however. There's not a single systematic study that demonstrates that presidents can reliably move others to support them. Unsurprisingly, a year into his administration, many were frustrated and surprised by the widespread resistance to his major policy proposals. As you may know, I've documented the public's response in great detail in two books, Overreach and Predicting the Presidency, so only briefly summarize it here. There are a few of the president's smaller proposals that were popular before he took office and remain so after he was in office. The public always likes to raise taxes on the rich. It likes to skewer bankers. They're very happy doing things like that. But he could not obtain majority or even plurality support over time for any of his major initiatives, including those for health care, environmental protection, the economic stimulus, and bailing out the banking and auto companies, even though many of us may agree that those were wise policies. In general, public opinion moved against the president over time. Andrew Kohut, president of the Pew Research Center, summarized these trends well when he declared at the end of 2009, and I quote, "What's really exceptional at this stage of Obama's presidency is the extent to which the public has moved in a conservative direction on a range of issues. These trends have emanated as much from the middle of the electorate as from the highly energized conservative right." Now, the protracted focus on the Affordable Care Act, probably the least popular major piece of legislation passed since the advent of public opinion polling, helped energize the right and kept the administration from focusing on the economy, which was the public's highest priority. Now, let me interject here, in case there's any doubt, that I fully support the Affordable Care Act and also the expansion of its coverage on the state level, which my state has failed to do as of yet. Nevertheless, in general, and despite voting for a presidential candidate espousing change, the public had not changed its basic skepticism of government or its resistance to paying for it. The scope of the response to the recession discouraged rather than encouraged demand for government services. Political analyst Charlie Cook termed the effort to pass a large agenda rather than focusing on the economy as a colossal miscalculation. In addition, identification with the Democratic Party declined substantially, as did evaluations of the party's ability to handle issues relative to that of the Republicans' ability. These party assessments provided the foundation for the stunning Democratic losses in the 2010 midterm elections, 63 seats in the House and 6 in the Senate. And of course, that undermined the administration's ability to govern in succeeding years. The Democratic Party also experienced its worst showing in state elections in generations, leaving it vulnerable to gerrymandering, which favored the Republicans after the 2010 census, and made it more difficult to achieve a number of policy goals, including broad access to health care at the state level, and increasing the probability, of course, of Republican majorities in Congress. Following the 2014 midterm elections, Democrats had the smallest contingents in the U.S. House and in state legislatures since the 71st Congress of 1929 and 1930. Now, how could this bright, articulate, decent, and knowledgeable president have such a difficult time in obtaining public support? Did the president fumble the ball, making tactical errors in his attempts to govern? Although no president is perfect, the Obama White House was not severely mismanaged. It wasn't politically insensitive or prone to making avoidable mistakes. I've written about this in detail, but efforts at public relations are the topic of another talk. But nevertheless, the president himself was self-critical of his public relations efforts. He didn't have a policy problem, he thought. Instead, he had a communications problem. Yet, I would argue that ineffective implementation of a strategy is not the explanation for the lack of progress in transforming policy and politics. Instead, the problem was in the strategies themselves and the belief that they could succeed. Presidential leadership is highly dependent on the context, the opportunity structure in which the president finds himself. I often refer to the opportunity structure as the president's strategic position. Again, I provide detailed evidence for what I'm about to say in the books I mentioned earlier, but let me briefly review the president's position. And this, of course, is beyond his control. For all presidents, their strategic positions relative to the public have 4 dimensions. First, is there a clear mandate, a widespread view that the public supports change? For President Obama, as for most presidents, the answer was no. Second, does public opinion support the general direction of the president's policies? Is there a broad public predisposition for government activism? Again, the answer was no, which is what we should expect from our understanding of the nature of public opinion. And public opinion almost always moves contrary to the president's position, no matter who the president is. Third, how polarized is public opinion? Are opposition party identifiers open to supporting the president's initiatives? Sadly, the answer for President Obama, as for all modern presidents, is no. Polarization reached new highs for the modern presidency under Barack Obama. Now, it went even higher under Donald Trump, I should add. The fourth facet of the potential for public leadership focuses on the long run. How malleable is public opinion? And the answer is hardly at all. Every president faces the same challenges to leading the public. The long-term constraints on opinion change include the public's lack of attention to politics, the difficulty of ensuring the public's reception and understanding of messages. President Obama was frustrated that the public thought he had raised their taxes. He was frustrated that the public did not understand the very specific and real benefits of Obamacare. There's the public's general predispositions, which are very, very difficult to change. There's misinformation. Just think of death panels. They mentioned earlier today, the death panels regarding ACA, which of course was completely untrue. And the public's loss aversion. They don't like change. You know when the Affordable Care Act became popular? Well, I can tell you exactly when it became popular. It became popular right after Donald Trump's election, when it looked like Donald Trump was going to change the Affordable Care Act. And for the first time, it got majority support. That's when it became popular. No president has been successful in overcoming these challenges. In sum, despite the historic and decisive nature of his election, Barack Obama did not enjoy a favorable environment for making major changes in public policy. And most of all of this was beyond his control. Now, the president displayed the analytical insight necessary to identify opportunities for change and many of the skills and characteristics necessary to take advantage of opportunities, including energy, perseverance, and resiliency. What he lacked was a framework for evaluating his ability to expand or even maintain his coalition and avoid long-term strategic failure. Now, we'll never know if it had been prudent for the president to have moved more slowly and with a narrower focus, nurtured his electoral majority, built greater public confidence in his leadership, and emerged with a stronger mandate to pursue his postponed campaign agenda. It's possible the Democrats could not have passed an overhaul of health care at any other time, and that doing so is worth losing the ability to act on a range of other important issues and the rest of the administration. Perhaps that's true. What we know for certain is that it would have been useful for the White House to have made a rigorous and informed assessment of the potential of his leadership, so that the president could understand the trade-offs he was likely to face and choose accordingly. For example, understanding that he would not in the short term be able to change public opinion regarding healthcare reform or the fiscal stimulus, the two most visible issues of his first 2 years, might have cast a different light on his decisions regarding his agenda and the sequencing of initiatives. I should add, I'll just, a quick personal story. I was reading a book by Jonathan Alter, a journalist you may know, and I was reading along, and I came to the opening of a new chapter, and it said, Barack Obama was quite taken with the theories of George Edwards that he read about from Ezra Klein in The New Yorker, which is how things actually get to the White House, not because they read my books, because they don't have time. And so Barack Obama and the latter part of his administration knew perfectly well that he was not going to move public opinion, and many of his top aides answered questions in the press in response to demands that he go out and argue again for public policies. He knew perfectly well that it was not likely to be successful, despite his very substantial rhetorical skills. At any rate, let me sum up. The Obama administration overestimated the opportunities for change in its environment and the president's ability to create new opportunities by moving public opinion. When the president thought he could fashion opportunities for change by expanding his supporting coalition, promoting a large liberal agenda seemed to pose little political risk. Yet the White House could not obtain public support for many of its most visible proposals, nor could it attract Republican votes in Congress, of course. These failures were inevitable and demonstrate the importance of making clear-eyed strategic assessments of the opportunity structure of a new administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Dr. Mercieca.
Hello.
Hello.
I'd also like to thank Mina and the whole Hofstra community for welcoming us and for putting on such an excellent program. I'm already learning a lot, and that's really exciting for me. In thinking about Barack Obama's communication legacy, it's hard for me to not think about comparing Obama with Donald Trump. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about both of them. But in retrospect, when I think about Barack Obama's communication strategies, I see a savvy use of emerging technology, but I also see restraint. Obama's approach was to use the power of communication to persuade, not to coerce. He communicated as a president, not as a demagogue. Scholars of presidential leadership have traditionally worked within the paradigm of the rhetorical presidency, which is an institutional argument about the way that 20th century presidents went over the heads of Congress to speak directly to the people in the hope that the people would pressure Congress to enact the president's agenda. According to the rhetorical presidency model, the press and the presidency once cooperated to distribute the news to the public, which upset the balance of powers between the branches of government, making the executive branch more powerful than Congress. In the rhetorical presidency, Jeffrey Toulis explained that the modern mass media facilitated the development of the rhetorical presidency by giving the president the means to communicate directly and instantly to a large national audience, and by reinforcing the shift from written messages to verbal dramatic performances. In return for its cooperation, the press gained access to the president and content for its news reports. But the relationship between the press and the president was threatened in the post-Watergate era. By the turn of the century, presidents could no longer count on the press to carry their message to the people. Shanto Iyengar writes in Media Politics that the average soundbite on national network news broadcasts in 1968 was more than 60 seconds long. And I've shown these to my political comm students, and they can't believe, they get bored after about 20 seconds. They can't believe how long they used to let presidents and presidential candidates talk on the news. By 2004, the average soundbite was just 7.7 seconds. Presidents and candidates found that it was hard to communicate with the public effectively. The media filtered out their message. New and social media gave candidates and presidents new opportunities for leverage over the press, changing the relationship between the press and the presidency. In 2004, Stephen Hartnett and I described in Presidential Studies Quarterly, editor-in-chief here, the post-rhetorical presidency of George W. Bush. We thought that Bush's presidential communication was characterized less by the rhetorical presidency model of eloquence, logic, pathos, or narrative storytelling, and more by the public relations techniques of ubiquitous public chatter, waves of disinformation, and cascades of confusing, causing misdirection. It made sense that with sound bites as short as they were and audiences fractured into smaller and smaller bits, presidents would communicate more often in the hope of getting their messages through the news filter. We didn't know, however, whether Bush was an anomaly or if the way that he communicated represented the new normal. It became clear with Barack Obama's presidency that the older notion of the rhetorical presidency just didn't make sense anymore, and that we were now firmly in the era of the post-rhetorical presidency. The fracturing of media, the rise of social media had fundamentally changed the relationship between the press and the presidency. If the era of the rhetorical presidency was characterized by a relationship between the presidency and the press that was reciprocal, mutually beneficial, and stable, then the era of the post-rhetorical presidency is characterized by a relationship between the presidency and the press that is independent, competitive, and unstable, like Obama creating his own news channel and taking content away from the White House press corps. He did that, though. As George W. Bush had done, Obama also used post-rhetorical communication strategies to go over the heads of Congress and around the news filter to speak directly to supporters. Obama's post-rhetorical presidency relied upon three communication strategies: strict message control, going around the news filter, and using social media to create intimacy between the president and his followers. We've already heard so many examples of these things this morning. Obama's 2008 campaign built a massive phone and email database and used it to communicate directly with his supporters, avoiding the news and media filter whenever possible. The electing the president post-election mortems of 2008 and 2012 explain why Obama's campaign adopted these strategies. One of the things that we did, explained Chief Communications Officer Anita Dunn, was communicate, by and large, most of our news directly to our supporters. By the 2012 campaign, Obama's team had expanded its online network so that he was connected to 90% of Facebook users in the United States, according to Deputy Campaign Manager Stephanie Cutter. Cutter explained that Obama's campaign used Facebook to run a vertical, top-down, and horizontal friend-to-friend campaign because people trust their information when it's coming from a Facebook friend much more than if it's me on TV saying something. Obama's campaign would have folks who supported the campaign list and link their Facebook profiles to the campaign so that the campaign could then search out their friends, figure out whether they were persuadable or had committed to a campaign candidate. And then they would prompt their campaign followers to reach out to their undecided friends and tell them what issues they were persuadable on and give them talking points for how to communicate to persuade to their friends. So using strategies that by 2016 we heard about and we were shocked, they were already doing that in 2012. It's fascinating. In communicating directly to supporters, Obama's campaign was able to both control the candidate's message and develop intimacy between him and his supporters. According to Democratic National Committee Director of Communications, Karen Finney, people really want to feel like they're part of a community. Engaging people and making them feel like they're getting a little bit of an inside look into the campaign, or they're really a part of something bigger, will make you far more successful. Avoiding the news filter and taking his message directly to supporters won elections for Obama. Other campaigns adopted his strategies. As a presidential candidate, Trump dominated our public sphere, not by creating intimacy in the same way, but in other ways. He relied upon outrage to gain and keep the nation's attention, earning approximately $5 billion of free media attention over the course of his 2016 campaign. Trump's outrageousness was good for the media's bottom line. So that competitive relationship that Obama had nurtured, in turn, eroded the trust and the relationship between the press and the president. It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. CBS CEO Leslie Moonreeves revealed in 2016, "I've never seen anything like this, and this is going to be a very good year for us." Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Keep going. The outraged president uses traditional and non-traditional media to provoke daily and sometimes hourly outrages, which keeps both his base and his opposition attentive and engaged. Within the attention economy, being outrageous is the most efficient way to set the nation's news agenda, frame issues, and persuade some citizens. Outrage has the added benefit of unifying audiences against whatever is named as the target of outrage, which is good for solidifying Trump's base. Trump used outrage to keep the nation on edge, which was terrible for Democratic stability, but good for Trump's political career. That outrage, rewarded with our attention, allowed him to control our public sphere. Obama used community organizing principles. He boxed out the press, but he communicated democratically for democracy. As we've seen since Obama's presidency, presidential communication can easily slide into demagoguery. The president can use communication against democracy as easily as they can use it for democracy. Just 9 months after 20,000 people attended a Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden in New York City, philosopher John Dewey, 80 years old and too frail to deliver the speech himself, gave a stark warning from that same stage. The task before Americans was clear, Dewey believed. They had to choose between autocracy and democracy. If they wanted democracy to survive, Dewey warned, Americans had to start thinking of it as more than just a political system. Americans could only defeat Nazism if they recognized that democracy is also a way of life, a specific way of associating, thinking, and communicating. Ours is another era like Dewey's, and we also have a choice to make between democracy and autocracy. Like in 1939, our choice is urgent, and it's later than we think. International nonpartisan organizations like Freedom House say that democracy in America is threatened and backsliding. Our democracy is backsliding because a lot of us do not associate or communicate in democratic ways. John Dewey knew that democracy was threatened by intolerance, abuse, or the calling of names because of differences of opinion, all strategies used by Donald Trump in 2016. Dewey called all of those anti-democratic communication practices treason to the democratic way of life. He explained that everything which bars freedom and fullness of communication sets up barriers that divides human beings and into sets and cliques, into antagonistic sects and factions, which undermines democracy itself. Barring freedom and fullness of communication and dividing people into antagonistic groups is exactly how autocrats destroy democracy. Treason is a strong word, but I think its use is warranted here. A Democrat is someone who is motivated by freedom, equality, social justice, and political practices that allow all citizens to share power. As Dewey warned, there are certain ways of associating, thinking, and communicating that amount to treason because they increase distrust, polarization, and frustration between citizens, as well as between citizens and their government. In so doing, those treasonous communication practices threaten the fragile trust upon which democracy rests, which erodes democracy itself. Democracy is a way of life. Those who seek unlimited power for themselves, their party, their religion, or their race at the expense of others commit treason against democracy. Since 2015, our public sphere has been saturated with that kind of treasonous communication, and it's only getting worse. Those skilled in the dark arts of communication, propagandists, demagogues, conspiracy theorists, and manipulators of all kinds use communication as a weapon against us and against our democracy. Communication is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used to create democracy or to destroy it. So when I reflect back on Barack Obama's communication strategies, all I can see is a president who used communication for the democratic way of life. And I miss that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mercieca. Professor Turner.
Thanks, Phil. So I'm having one of those moments that we all have when you go, I've got to follow that. My colleagues are just, their understanding of what happened in the Obama administration is just really salient to me. I approached this issue of communication in the Obama administration from a little bit of a different perspective. As Phil mentioned, I had the good fortune on most days to be inside the wire with regard to the Obama administration. I want to say something at the outset that I always say because my background is in national security and foreign policy and national security communication. I've never been a political appointee. And most people are surprised to hear that because I had 3 different positions working in the Obama administration. I think I'm the only person to ever serve as Deputy White House Press Secretary but not be a political appointee. And the reason that I've never been a political appointee is because I believe that if you are in the national security space, that the most important thing is that whether you're a communicator or you're a subject matter expert, the most important thing is that your focus remain on what's best from a national security perspective. So what I'm going to do today is I am going to talk about communication just briefly in the Obama administration, but I'm going to talk about how the trajectory of President Obama's communication evolved over time. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that trajectory was, in some sense, due to a realization, a sort of growing realization during his presidency of the limits of effective communication. And some of this will touch on what my colleagues have said here today, but one of the things I think is most interesting about President Obama is that if you look at those early days of his communication, we go back to 2004 when he began talking about hope and change and sort of came on the national scene. Those days when there was his words sort of dripped with optimism and a sense of what the future could be. We go back to those days, and one of the things I think we can all agree on is that the reason that he appealed to people from so many different walks of life is because he truly believed in his message, and that really helped the people around him, that helped people he talked to really believe in his message. But as you look at some of the papers that were submitted for this conference, and you look at some of the readings of my colleagues, and one of the things that you see, and I saw this from the inside, and we debated this, we talked about this a lot on the inside, is that as you fast forward to the president getting elected, and you continue to look at and listen to the messages of hope and change, as the president talked about his policies and how those policies would help the American people, what we begin to see is that sort of frustration over the fact that these were policies that everyone on the inside believed were good and necessary policies. And there was this sort of belief that and I'll talk about this in a minute, that if these were good policies and if we were communicating effectively, then people should be in the president's corner with regard to these policies. And this is sort of from the inside perspective. What we saw over time is that there was this sort of realization that when it came to the intransigence of Congress and the idea that we were dealing with politicians who, under no circumstances, were going to allow this president to have a win, we began to see President Obama going out and giving speeches where, and we talked about this internally, where there would be a speech written for the president, and as you all know, the president always had a heavy hand in his speech writing. But Ben Rhodes or Keenan Cody, someone would write a speech for him, and he'd go out and he'd give a speech. But the president began to have this internal dialogue that we would all see come out when the president went off script. And so he'd be giving a speech, and I'd be sitting there. We're following along on the speech. And he'd pause, and we'd all pause because we knew that frustration over the fact that he was talking about policies that people should support, they'd be on board with. That frustration was about to come through in something that he was going to say. Now, the really interesting thing about that is that it wasn't just frustration with the fact that the policies, that his communication was not resonating with people when it came to getting people in his corner, but it was also frustration with supporters of the president. The president has given interviews where he talked about how, when he was elected, a lot of his supporters believed that he could wave a wand and simply make things happen. And I think he famously said, presidents don't get a wand. And so that frustration began to come out over time. So what they were realizing is that with good policies, George talked about, healthcare, economy, immigration. With good policies, there were still these limitations. So I want to focus for a minute on this question of the limitations of good communication from two perspectives. I was the director of communication for national intelligence when Edward Snowden took what we believe are hundreds of thousands of documents and first went to China and then ultimately off to Russia. And one of the great examples I have of how the administration really believed that effective communication had the power to help people understand that the people inside the administration were doing right came when, after dealing with this issue for about 3 or 4 months, and we were sort of doing the triage, we had an opportunity to take a deep breath and really develop our communication strategy. And it was my job on behalf of the intelligence community to try to lead that communication strategy from an intel perspective. And I'll tell you what we all agreed what was necessary to say. When it came to our intelligence collection efforts, we had to help the American people understand that everything that we were doing was authorized by Congress, and that the secret laws that underpinned our intelligence collection agencies were laws that were passed by Congress, and that the execution of those laws were within the constraints that Congress had provided us. So basically, there was full oversight that everything was above board. And as long as we could make the American people understand that, then this whole Edward Snowden affair, this whole idea that the intelligence community is looking in your bedroom window and reading your emails and opening your mail, all that would go away if we could just make people understand that. I sat out at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and I had a group of retired intelligence officers come in, and it was such a heated meeting because they were all telling me, you just have to tell a better story. If you tell a better story, then the American people will understand. So we spent months telling that story. We went to college campuses, we went to events, we sat down with reporters, and we kept telling people, it's overseen by Congress. They made the laws. We're acting within the constraints of those laws. And eventually, I was at an event, and a man stood up and he said, look, I've heard you say this a dozen times, but here's the bottom line. We don't care that Congress authorized you to do these things. We don't care that you're following the laws. We don't care that they provide oversight. We simply don't like it. It was at that moment that I realized that when I go back today and I look at the communication strategy, not just for this event, but the communication strategy that we had for a lot of policy initiatives and issues in the Obama administration, I go back and I look and I think to myself, these are effective messages. This is good communication strategy. But in some cases, it simply did not work, not because it wasn't good communication, but because people simply did not like what we were communicating. So when I think about this issue of the limits of effective communication, it exists really on two planes. There's this issue of, as I tell my students, I tell them all the time that if you have a good story to tell based on good policies and based on right-minded ideas, then generally speaking, you can get people in your corner. Generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, you can. And the Obama administration became frustrated sometimes because they had good policies that were right-minded and were good for people. They gave people something, and they couldn't get people on board. And so they were realizing the limitations of good communication from that perspective. On the other hand, when you have policies that people simply don't like, it's just the case that no amount of effective communication is going to get people on board simply because they don't like the policies. So from a communication perspective, I think the Obama administration put an immense amount of emphasis on the power of communication. In many ways, the way they put it, an immense amount of perspective on the law. You know, there were always lawyers around with everything in the Obama administration, but an immense amount of focus on communication. And I think that one of the reasons that we're having these discussions is because there are real limits to effective communication. And I think that over time they realize those. And I think that today, even today, as I talk to some of my former colleagues, and if you watch the president interviews, that frustration persists today. So I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Professor Turner. If any of you have questions, we ask that you please come to the mics. But as you come to the mics, I have questions for you. Dr. Edwards, can you talk at all about, given the context of the Obama administration, what opportunities did he miss? If he were to ride, say, where public opinion was instead of trying to shape it, what do you feel he could have done?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm not sure that I actually missed much. It wasn't a very, I mean, if you think about the times and what he had to do, which was deal with the economy, he had to do that. There had to be some bailouts. There had to be a fiscal stimulus. He had to save the economy. And we've heard a lot about that in earlier panels. And of course, he had to do that. So right away, that put him in a hole because not all of that was popular. Even though it may have saved the economy of the whole world, nevertheless, it wasn't popular. So what opportunities were left for him at this point? Well, apparently very few. I mean, as I've said, he didn't have a good strategic position with the public. As I have notes, I won't repeat them because I'm discussing on a panel later. He didn't have a good opportunity with Congress either for most of his tenure, and I'll explain that in detail if you come to that panel. So I'm not sure that there was a lot. I think there is a more sophisticated answer though, and that is that let's just imagine that he sequenced his policies differently. And so he sequenced immigration, some version of an immigration policy, and an environmental protection policy. And he did have them, and he was going through with one of them. Environmental protection got through one of the houses. So a carbon capture. Well, and so if, let's say you got that through, because at this time in the first 2 years, you've got some majorities, okay? So you can maybe get that through. Now, can you also, under the circumstances, get through healthcare at that point? And remember how long it took to get healthcare through and how difficult it was to get healthcare through. And they did it every single vote. And then once Massachusetts, you don't recall this if you're young, but there was a Senate election in Massachusetts and it went Republican, which was not supposed to happen. And that really put them in a hole. So the House had to pass exactly what the Senate had passed. Exactly, because they couldn't take it back to the Senate because it wouldn't pass. So that's how bad it was, because they only had 59 votes as opposed to 60. So they couldn't. So Nancy Pelosi did a phenomenal job, as did the president, and gaining the appropriate votes. But so you might say, okay, we lost opportunities to do these. If we had done that and not irritated people, they shouldn't have been irritated, but they were with the Affordable Care Act, and that became, as Congressman Israel said earlier, that became the death knell for an awful lot of Democrats. And so if they had not lost the majorities in the midterm elections and still had majorities, and there's a lot of ifs there. There's a lot of ifs. I'm speculating, I'm speculating. Then maybe they could have accomplished more. It's an imponderable. And I merely raise this because I think it's important to think strategically and to think about sequencing. George W. Bush had the same matter when Karl Rove said, we really should have done immigration before we tried Social Security in the second term. There wasn't the good sequencing of policies. So that's my best answer, and it's inherently a speculative one.
If other panelists have remarks along the way, feel free to jump in.
Sure. If you ask that question of at least most of the former Obama officials that I know, they one area, and I agree with George, but one area where I would say that they say there was a missed opportunity was in gun legislation. And I'll tell people, I'll just be real quick here. I remember in the aftermath of Sandy Hook, I had a young daughter who was in school. I remember I was at the Pentagon, and instead of going to work for 3 days, I'd go to my daughter's school, and I'd sit in the car outside the school for the entire day, for the entire work day. And I remember thinking to myself, if there is, an issue that is going to change everything, then this is it. And I remember having conversations with colleagues at the time that, something's going to happen. We're going to do something on this. This is this is the one. And even today, there's a lot of regret that, understandably, there wasn't a lot the president could do. We know that, but it's one of those areas where people really wish that there had been more push.
If I could just add something to that, I can remember Maureen Dowd Whoops, sorry. I didn't mean I didn't mean to make a point by hitting the mic. Maureen Dowd wrote an article in her column in the New York Times saying, why can't the president be like, Franklin Roosevelt, and go out and, and just get the public on his side. Let's get gun control. Why can't he just do that? Why can't he just do that? And just was berating him for not being Lyndon Johnson. And I think we heard this morning, the response is he didn't have the majorities and you can't move the public. The public did. A majority of the public wanted more gun control. That's not hard. I mean, it always happens after these. But the problem is getting the Republicans, getting the Republican constituencies, and they're unmovable. So, those who are already on your side are really, really happy for you to propose gun control. The others don't, and you can't change their minds, apparently. It's intractable.
Thank you. I do have a question for Dr. Mercieca, but I'd like to go to the people at the mic first.
It seems to me that it was not, my name is Rosanna Parati, I'm a political science professor here. Even though he had these majorities, and even though his message may have been palatable to most people on things like gun control, still you could not achieve this. It occurs to me that there are new media at this time. What role did social media, if any, play in the chorus of voices that were critical and contrary?
Well, I'll just say that with regard to the administration's use of social media, I was the first administration to really use social media in ways that brought new audiences and brought new attention to issues. But it was early enough that if we were starting over today, one of the things that the administration would do differently is social media monitoring and developing strategies for recognizing in social media when a narrative about a policy or an issue is going sideways. What would often happen is there'd be a comprehensive communication plan put together, and there would be a launch, and in social media, we'd be sort of watching the very positive things that were happening, but what was happening beneath the surface, or what was happening in those channels that we didn't monitor so well, was that there was a groundswell of criticism and negative feedback. And when those things begin to jump from platform to platform and they begin to grow, when that's happening, it's too late. As you all know, these things spread like a virus. And so I think there was too much sort of, feeling really positive in the initial moments after policy initiative, but not really being nimble enough to recognize that you've got to be watching for those alternative narratives, and you've got to have a strategy to get on those alternative narratives and knock them down quickly.
Thank you. Thanks for this discussion. It seems that all of you have established that there are limitations to rhetoric and communication. And I would like to sort of press you all to maybe play a card as to what you think, if there are any limitations specific to Obama. In my dissertation, I use Mercieca's work, your text, it was a co-written text, the heroic expectations, the rhetoric of heroic expectations, and you list 3 burdens, institutional, contextual, and personal. And I would like to sort of merge that in this discussion with Dr. Edwards, 4 dimensions, and also bring Shawn Turner in on this as to, for you, Mercieca, would one of those burdens be more significant or native to Obama? For example, maybe the personal burden could be race, and that could be the source, the controlling principle of interpreting different laws, and how might you respond, Dr. Edwards and Shawn Turner, to a proposed limitation? Do you have your own, or do you see this as just endemic to any president? I think I'm getting the gist of that. But if there's anything native to Obama, please speak to that. And I'll just give one more context. The reason why I think that might be one or two of these things, playing my cards, because when we mentioned, at least as the word the public was used in the conversation, there are some policies where there's an overwhelming majority that the public supports. There's an overwhelming majority of support. And what that means is that are there some other issues rather than rhetoric that are at hand? So it's not just the limitation of rhetoric, but it's also a limitation of the political structure.
Yeah, thank you for that very thoughtful and detailed question and for reading that book. So what Justin Vaughn and I wrote about, so we had a conference in 2010 about Obama, and it was the Obama Phenomenon Conference in our town. And we brought all these scholars here and they were bummed. It was like a year into Obama's presidency, and they were bummed out. And just thinking about why, all of these scholars were bummed out really prompted me to think a lot about the presidency itself. Because it wasn't that he was using rhetoric wrong, right? It wasn't that he was doing anything other than like exactly what rhetorical scholars since Aristotle have said, to do. And you want to convince people, which is to lay out good arguments and all that. So he was doing all of the rhetoric right. That wasn't the problem. So I started to think about what was wrong with the crowd. And what I realized is that they had these impossibly high expectations for this guy. And so then I thought about, what did Obama do to cultivate those expectations? And then, how are those expectations different for Obama than they are for other presidents, or how are they the same? And so what we realized is that, of course, there are institutional expectations for the president. They are heroic in nature. When they introduced you, they mentioned your handbook on presidency, and there's a really great chapter on the expectations gap and the expectations for the president. In there, we learned a lot from your work, from your editing work, we have these expectations for the president that he can't or she can't fulfill, and that's an institutional burden. But then there are these contextual burdens. So whether it's the economy, or whether it's gun violence, or whether it's, the new social media networks, or, whatever it is. So that then informs what they can achieve. And then the last one is the personal burden. So every president comes into office, they're too old, they're in a wheelchair, the color of their skin, they're the first woman, someday, like whatever it is, right? They have something that burdens them in terms of how we expect them to perform, what they're able to perform. All of those things are fascinating to think about when you think about, the possibilities of rhetoric and getting your policy objectives achieved. So I don't know as much about his 4 things as he does, so I should probably let Dr. Edwards answer that second part.
Well, the four dimensions of what I call the president's strategic position relative to the public are common. I mean, they're relevant to all presidents, but a few presidents have a sense of a mandate. There's a general sense of mandate, and everyone claims it, and every new administration thinks they have one, but they really don't. But the long-term problems all presidents face, and it's very difficult to change public opinion. You just have to start with that premise. It just is very bloody difficult to do.
People are hard.
President Obama had a couple of other problems. It's quite natural when you are a Democrat and there's a Republican president that you want to talk about change. You are a candidate. You say, we got to change because we got this lousy Republican in there, right? And we got to change. Moreover, we got war and we got a recession. So that's not good. So I'm all about change and hope, right? So that inevitably elevates expectations. And I don't think that there's a lot you can do about it. But I think President Obama, and Jennifer said, every president has something unique. President Obama, of course, was the first black president. And I'm thinking of a map. The New York Times did a great interactive map right after the election. And it showed most of the country moving in a Democratic direction from the last election, which is what you'd expect because you had a Democrat winning. But there was a belt starting in Western Pennsylvania, coming right down through, Kentucky and Tennessee, all the way over into Oklahoma, okay? And my less charitable moments, I call it the hillbilly belt, but we'll call it whatever you want, At any rate, and they're moving in the opposite direction. So instead of becoming more Democratic with Barack Obama on the ticket, they became more Republican. So and this, I think, you begin to see when I look at that, okay, there's the race issue. I think it's nothing more than the race issue, quite frankly. And so he had that to overcome as well. And we have a lot of data, and there's different ways that we measure, because you don't go out and ask questions, are you a racist? I mean, that isn't a sensible public policy, a public opinion polling measure. So we have other ways of measuring racial resentment. You may know all about them. I don't know. And he had that burden to overcome as well. And it was very, very, very difficult set of burdens he had.
Shawn?
Well, I'll just say very quickly, one thing you mentioned, do we think there were obstacles? I don't know if there were obstacles, but I will tell you something that I think President Obama was always keenly aware of. And research supports this in an interesting way. If Phil and I were coming in this room and it was full of people and we were going to give a keynote speech, and Phil came up to give a keynote speech, you've never heard Phil speak before, you have no idea who he is. Research would indicate that if it's Phil, that everyone in the room would have a general level of anxiety over what they're about to hear. Now, that general level of anxiety is sort of, there's a range at which we all feel. The research shows that if I come up before you, and it's the same situation, you don't know me, you've never heard of me before, and I'm going to give a speech, your level of anxiety is going to be a little higher. Now, the interesting thing about the research is it's not based on race. It's going to be a little higher for the Black people in the room, too. And it's my response. What I have to do is, as I begin to speak and try to connect with you, I bring that anxiety down so long as I don't feed into any of those existing biases that you may have. And so I think President Obama was always keenly aware of the fact that he needed to make sure that he was appealing to everyone. And so it's one of the reasons why, we talk about code switching, one of the reasons why if you ever had an opportunity to be in the room with him when it was just among friends, his tone, his vernacular, it was a little different. So I do think in the public light, it was a little different from that perspective.
Thank you. Great question. Go ahead.
My question is more in reference to communication as well, and the difference that really between Obama, Trump, and Biden. I recently read that Biden has passed more bipartisan legislation than both Obama did during his 8 years and Trump did. What was his communication skills so much more superior than theirs was to be able to bring legislation together, to get the Republicans to agree to certain things that were on his agenda, while Obama and Trump were very unsuccessful in really getting major legislation where both parties could come together and say, we agree.
Who'd like that one?
Well, I think part of the answer is the nature of the legislation that President Biden has proposed, and the bipartisan legislation that you're thinking of probably is infrastructure and chips, factories and that sort of thing. And there's support. There's support among Republicans for that. So it's a lot easier. But when it comes to other kinds of, there's not an immigration bill. You don't have an immigration bill. We haven't had one for a long time. So I think it's the nature of what they're proposing, and I don't think that we should assume that its communications has anything to do with it at all. Quite frankly, I'm not denigrating communications. That's not what I mean to say. I'm merely saying that may not be the critical factor in the passage of this legislation in dealing with Congress.
Yeah, and I'll just add that during the Obama administration, if Republicans wrote a bill and it had everything that they loved in it, and President Obama said, okay, let's pass it, then they'd say, no way. We're not going to give you that win. And that was just the nature of the environment.
In fact, Senator Grassley, I remember there's a famous anecdote. President Obama had Senator Grassley and asked him that exact question. You know, when I give you everything that you're asking for, will you vote for it? And Grassley said no. You know, now what are you going to do? How do you cut a deal with someone who won't take yes for an answer?
Right. Then you have, President Biden. You know, he's got longstanding relationships with many members of Congress, certainly in the Senate, and he has a very different style. So I do think that there was a absolutely no when it comes to President Obama, and I think President Biden has been able to cut through some of that.
It comes to mind as I hear those answers that Obama once scolded the Republican Congress for not acting like grown-ups. And you don't hear that kind of rhetoric from Biden, and I'm curious if that's not a consequence of having spent a lot of time in the Senate. Okay, we have our next question.
Yeah, first off, thank you guys for coming to Hofstra, by the way. My question is for Mr. Turner. In the beginning of the Obama presidency, with Obama really promising to, repair relationships with the Islamic world, between, the Islamic world and the West and America, what are some strengths and what are some weaknesses you think the Obama administration had during their time, in the Middle East and sending troops over and, defense spending? I just interested to hear your take on it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think it's an important one because it really gets at one of what's been, depending on your perspective, and I think an unfair criticism of the Obama administration. One of the earlier panels talked about transparency, and the Obama administration, particularly when it comes to the Arab world, the Obama administration was in a really challenging position because of perceptions here in the United States, perceptions that, for better or worse, were not always the right perceptions, were not always right-minded. But President Obama recognized that there was important work that needed to happen, and a lot of that work happened behind the scenes. It happened in secret. You may recall when cables were leaked, and you had sort of a laying bare of the communication between our diplomats and other diplomats around the world. And what you saw in those cables, despite the fact that there was a lot of talk about what was said, publicly versus what was said behind the scenes, but what you saw was a good faith effort to sort of open up our policies and our perspectives to those different views. It was really challenging for the administration because here in the United States, there was not a lot of tolerance for working with some of the partners and allies that we had to work with. I think about Saudi Arabia, for example, and I mean, it's still the case with regard to Saudi Arabia. We've and I'm just going to say, and many presidents have held their nose and worked with Saudi Arabia over the years. The Obama administration recognized that was absolutely necessary, but instead of doing what previous administrations had done, which was to make a very public case for it and to try to be very strong in that space, the Obama administration tried to be more nuanced about it. So it created some real challenges. It was a great question. My background's in the Middle East and North Africa, and I can tell you that during that time, the level of engagement that we had as an administration was probably higher than I've seen in any recent presidency.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Professor Richard Himmelfarb. I teach political science, and thank you all for being here. Mr. Turner, I was very interested in what you said when you were talking about communication in the Obama administration. And you said something to the effect of, well, President Obama and people in the administration began with the assumption that their policies were good. And then they assumed that if they went out and communicated these policies articulately and effectively, the public would like them. The next part of your story is that they were surprised to find that the public didn't like a lot of what they wanted to do. I'm thinking about, the Affordable Care Act, which kind of sends me circling back to the question of maybe the policies weren't so good. Maybe people had some type of justifiable reason for thinking that these policies were bad for them. And I'm just be interested in your reaction and the reaction of everybody else on the panel.
So I'll just very briefly say that I may not have communicated this clearly. I think that that sort of on both ends of the spectrum. There were policies that the administration put in place, or positions the administration took that that the public really did take issue with. And that was certainly the case with regard to intelligence collection. And it's part of the reason why, after really realizing that people aren't going, the idea that it's legal and Congress provides oversight, that's not going to resonate with people. And so we moved to we went down the path of intelligence reform, where we are much more transparent about our intelligence collection efforts today than we've ever been in the history of this country. We talk about intelligence in ways that makes me cringe at times. I think that with regard to some of the domestic policies and more domestic issues, that you had policies that really did give people something that they wanted for a long time. And I think that even when I say that they didn't resonate with people, you had people who were leveraging policies, who were taking advantage of the fact that these policies were giving them something, but in the very same breath, they were criticizing the policies, being critical of them. I mean, we have all of the examples of people who were using the Affordable Care Act, using Obamacare, but in the very same breath, they'd call into radio shows and they talk about, how this was socialism and other things along those lines. So, it was effective communication. People were using, they were on board with them in terms of, their daily lives, but they were still very critical of them from a communication perspective, which made them, made these policies seem as though they did not resonate with people. So
I would add that what happened during Obama's administration is that the communication environment changed such that what was political communication became information warfare, right, as a space. And so I think what the Obama administration did.
Would you just give an example of like an issue where that was the case?
Where an issue where that.
Yeah, where it became information warfare. Just throw
any issue. So think about like the Newtown shooting that we've been talking about so many times in gun control. So Barack Obama gives a beautiful speech. It's very moving. It's very presidential. He fulfills the obligations of what we call the priestly role of the presidency, right? Which is to heal the nation during this traumatic moment. Does all the things, right? Check, check, check all the boxes for good presidential communication in a political communication environment, right? In response, right, you have gun sales skyrocket. You have the introduction of the term crisis actor, right? You have Alex Jones on InfoWars talking day in and day out about how those children were not really murdered and that Obama is using this as an op to get your guns, right? That it was all a setup. Obviously, Alex Jones isn't allowed to say those things anymore, and he's been fined almost $1 billion for saying them. But, right, that is an exact example, right, of someone who is performing presidential communication perfectly to the moment, textbook, within an environment that is not political communication anymore, it's information warfare. And I just don't think that no matter what Obama did, no matter how good the policy was, it would have allowed for the kind of effect that, he could maybe have expected. Does that make sense?
Just the only reply I have, though, is you're implying that Alex Jones is the typical, Republican who owns a firearm.
Right.
And I would say Alex Jones is really a fringe character.
I know you would. 9 million people go to his website every month. Alex Jones has taught the Republican Party, and this started, we saw this effect in 2015 and 2016, taught the Republican Party how to use information warfare strategies. So one of the things that Alex Jones brags about on his show in 2015 is how many times he talked about things on information on his show, InfoWars, and then Donald Trump said them on his campaign speeches. And it was like, there's 7 different things. Right? You can trace out, if you're good at tracing out those kinds of things, you can trace out, they call it narrative laundering, how things move from information warfare, InfoWars, to Tucker Carlson. And my dad watches Tucker Carlson every night. He would never go to the InfoWars website, right? But he doesn't know that the narratives and the memes and the frames that he hears on Tucker Carlson actually have come from these extreme places. That's how it works today.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes and 2 questions, so thank you, Richard.
Okay.
Short answers.
Hi, I'm Andrea Labresco. I teach here at Hofstra, teach teachers how to teach.
Good.
So I'm thinking, especially since you just used the word priestly communication, I'm thinking there's a big difference. Obama was great at that, but I'm thinking the difference is with Obama and maybe Democrats in general on the pithy soundbite stuff. Not so good. I mean, you think of the race speech by Obama, which was fabulous, but there was no soundbite from it, versus when I think about healthcare, death tax, economy, death tax, healthcare, death panel. I can call those up immediately, and it's really hard for me to call up any quickie phrases, partially based on the policy. Obamacare was sort of a Byzantine policy, right? I mean, so I'm wondering, to what extent do you think Democrats in general, Obama in particular, not so good at soundbite messaging?
Okay, so that's one of the things that that I talked about in my thing, is just the difference between how those sound bites are conveyed to the public in terms of time. But part of the information warfare, the environment today, is the agenda setting wars and the frame wars, right? And I think that there are different expectations from Democrats and Democratic supporters compared to Republicans and Republican supporters for what they expect for messaging. I think that there are good people on the Democratic side who have learned how to fight the frame wars. I think perhaps you're right that the Obama administration wasn't as interested in that, or as maybe they didn't acknowledge fast enough that that was what they needed to do. But you're right. I mean, if we talk about the border as a policy, we talk about immigration as a policy, and one side frames it as an invasion, and the other side frames it as a humanitarian crisis, those are going to activate different thoughts and policies, right, and emotional responses. And the Democratic Party perhaps hasn't done that effectively, and Obama probably.
If I could add just a quick thing. The Obama administration, as any administration, has complex policies. I mean, the Affordable Care Act is 1,300 some pages long. It has to be. And that's fine. That's fine. So it's hard to summarize that in a soundbite. The opposition just has to say death panels.
Right.
Even if it's a complete lie, which it was. That's all they have to say. I mean, it's simple. They don't have the responsibility for actually governing. So advantage to the opposition.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let this be our final question.
Yeah, I'll be brief. My name is Melvin Walker. I'm a graduate student here. Thank you for coming. I'm also an Army veteran, and I remember being a West Point cadet in 2009 where President Obama gave his speech at the United States Military Academy when he announced that he was concentrating military efforts in Afghanistan. I remember it being a really big moment. I also believe he gave a similar, or also monumentous speech, I believe, or regarding the Iran nuclear deal at American University. I was hoping you would comment on the president's decision on using certain settings to communicate his message and strategies.
Probably the right one to talk about that. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say that those decisions, I remember there was so much deliberation around those decisions. Where does the president go? Who does he surround himself with when making such consequential decisions? And what would happen, and it was a fascinating process, the professional communicators would come together, the policy people would come together, and they talk about the pros and cons of different settings. And those conversations, it would be really about making sure that, and this was something that I'll just, the idea that Democrats are strong on national security, the idea that Democrats, when it comes to the military, that Democrats support the military, all of those things were part of the discussion, right down to at the end of those speeches, if the president was going to take questions, which reporter the president takes a question from first, and there'd be conversations with reporters around it. So it was all part of making sure that if the president is going to lay out a policy decision that has been controversial or people have been uncertain about, that it was done in a way that communicated that there was thoughtful consideration and that the people who are going to be impacted by that decision, that the president was there with them, making sure that people understood that he cared about the impact it was going to have on them.
Thank you. And Professor Turner, Dr. Mercieca, and Dr. Edwards, thank you all very much for contributing to our session. And plenty more time during the conference to continue the conversation. Thank you all again for coming.
Thank you. That's great. I really appreciate it. Yeah.